The pristine hallways of Harmony Heights Academy gleamed under cold, fluorescent lights. But Benjamin Mitchell had stopped caring about perfection long ago. His calloused hands gripped the janitor cart as muffled sobs drifted from room 237, the same desperate crying that had echoed through these walls for 4 straight weeks. The Billionaire's twins, 6 years old and already broken by a world too loud, too bright, too overwhelming for their fragile minds. In his worn supply bag, nestled between industrial cleaners and forgotten dreams, lay a small sketchbook, the only piece of his former life he couldn't throw away. Tonight, those weathered pages would hold the key to something miraculous. But what he was about to create in the shadows would expose secrets that could destroy everything he'd built from the ashes of his past. Benjamin paused outside room 237, his weathered face etched with the kind of exhaustion that went deeper than missed sleep. The crying had intensified, raw, desperate sounds that no 6-year-old should ever make. He'd been working the night shift at this elite boarding school for 8 months now, invisible to the wealthy families who sent their children here like expensive packages to be stored and polished. Most nights, he moved through these halls like a ghost, cleaning up after privilege and pretending his own ghosts didn't follow him home. But these twins were different. Ruby and Jasper Ashford, the oil heiress's children, arrived 3 months ago in the middle of a bitter custody battle that had made headlines in the society pages. While other children complained about homework and cafeteria food, these two struggled with something far more complex. Ruby would cover her ears and rock when the hallway lights flickered. Jasper arranged his pencils in perfect geometric patterns, then melt down when someone moved them even slightly. The staff whispered about behavioral problems and special needs, their voices tinged with the kind of impatience reserved for inconvenient complications. Benjamin knew that look in their eyes. The same hollow bewilderment he'd seen in his own daughter's face 3 years ago, before the accident that took everything from him. Before Luna died and left him to raise 9-year-old Zoe alone, watching her struggle with grief counselors who spoke in textbook phrases, but never truly understood the weight of a child's broken heart. Luna had been different, though. She was an art therapist who believed that sometimes pictures could say what words couldn't, that healing came through creation rather than conversation. The memory of his wife's gentle hands guiding his own across a canvas still made his chest tighten. She'd taught him that art wasn't about technical perfection. It was about connection, about finding light in the darkest places. After she died, Benjamin had tried to keep painting, tried to honor her memory by continuing the work she'd started. But the art world was brutal to a grieving widower with no formal training, and eventually he'd packed away his brushes and taken whatever work he could find to keep food on the table and a roof over Zoe's head. Now, standing in this sterile hallway listening to 2 broken children cry themselves into exhaustion night after night, something stirred in Benjamin's chest that he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't hope exactly. Hope was too dangerous for someone who'd already lost everything once. It was simpler than that, more instinctual. It was the quiet recognition that some things were worth the risk of caring again, even when caring meant opening yourself up to the possibility of losing everything all over again. He pulled out his sketchbook, the leather cover soft and worn from years of carrying it everywhere like a talisman. The pages were filled with fragments, half-finished drawings of Zoe at breakfast, geometric patterns that reminded him of Luna's therapy techniques, abstract shapes that somehow captured the feeling of loneliness better than any photograph ever could. His hands moved without conscious thought, pencil scratching against paper in the dim hallway light. A creature took shape, neither human nor animal, but something in between, made of gentle curves and soft shadows. It was holding 2 small figures, protecting them from a world that felt too sharp and too loud. When he finished, Benjamin stared at the drawing for a long moment, surprised by what had emerged from his subconscious. The creature looked like a guardian, but also like a parent, the kind of presence that could make a frightened child feel safe enough to finally close their eyes. Without allowing himself to overthink it, he carefully tore the page from the sketchbook and slid it under the door of room 237. No words, no signature, just an offering from one broken soul to two others who might understand the language of images better than the language of authority figures and medical assessments. The crying stopped almost immediately. Benjamin held his breath, pressing his ear to the door, and heard something that made his heart skip, the soft rustle of paper, followed by whispered voices too quiet to make out words. Then, gradually, the kind of silence that spoke of rest rather than resignation. For the first time in 4 weeks, Ruby and Jasper Ashford were sleeping peacefully, and Benjamin Mitchell had no idea that this single act of anonymous kindness was about to unravel the carefully constructed walls he'd built around his new life. The next morning brought autumn sunlight streaming through the academy's grand windows, but Benjamin barely noticed as he moved through his cleaning routine with mechanical precision. He'd gotten home just as Zoe was getting ready for school, and the sight of his daughter's bright smile over her cereal bowl had reminded him why he'd chosen this invisible life. She was thriving at the local public school, making friends and laughing again in ways that had seemed impossible in those dark months after Luna's death. Sometimes security was worth more than dreams, even when those dreams came calling in the middle of the night. But when he returned to the dormitory wing that evening, Benjamin found himself slowing as he approached room 237. Taped to the inside of the door's window was his drawing, the guardian creature protecting the two small figures. But it was no longer alone. Surrounding it in crayon and colored pencil was an elaborate response. 2 children nestled safely in the creature's embrace, but now the scene was filled with swirling colors that seemed to move even in the still image. Musical notes floated through the air like butterflies, and geometric patterns formed protective borders around the entire composition. The style was unlike anything Benjamin had ever seen in children's artwork. There was a sophistication to the color choices, an understanding of visual harmony that spoke of minds that processed the world differently than most. Ruby had added layers of synesthetic beauty. Purples that hummed with the sound of lullabies, soft blues that tasted like safety. Jasper's contributions were mathematically precise, but somehow emotional too, patterns that created order out of chaos while still leaving room for his sister's flowing creativity. Together, the drawings told a story of 2 children who saw and felt the world more intensely than anyone around them realized. Benjamin stood in the hallway for several minutes, studying the collaborative artwork with the kind of professional appreciation he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. These weren't the scribblings of troubled children acting out. They were communications from young artists who'd found someone who finally spoke their visual language. The realization both thrilled and terrified him, because he recognized in their work the same hunger for understanding that had driven his own artistic journey before grief and necessity had derailed it. Over the following weeks, a silent conversation developed between Benjamin and the twins. Each night he would leave a small drawing outside their door, sometimes abstract patterns designed to soothe anxiety, sometimes whimsical creatures that seemed to understand the weight of carrying invisible differences in a world that demanded conformity. Each morning he would find their responses, growing more elaborate and emotionally complex with every exchange. Ruby began incorporating words into her images, describing colors and sounds in ways that made Benjamin realize she experienced synesthesia. Jasper's mathematical precision evolved into mandalas so intricate they seemed to pulse with their own internal logic. The anonymous art exchange was having an effect beyond the twins' improved sleep patterns. Benjamin found himself looking forward to work in ways he hadn't since Luna died, his creative instincts reawakening after years of dormancy. At home, Zoe noticed her father humming while he made breakfast, and she began leaving her own drawings on his bedside table, bright, cheerful pictures of their small family that reminded him that healing could happen gradually, one small connection at a time. He started sketching again during his lunch breaks, filling pages with studies of light and shadow that felt like prayers in pencil and charcoal. But the real change was happening in room 237. Staff members began commenting on the Ashford twins' improved behavior during day hours. Ruby spoke more often in class, using color metaphors that delighted her art teacher, even as they confused her academic instructors. Jasper's meltdowns became less frequent, and when they did occur, he seemed to recover more quickly, as if he'd developed internal coping mechanisms that didn't rely entirely on external structure. The night crying stopped completely, replaced by the soft sounds of creative activity that drifted under their door until well past official lights out. It was during one of these quiet midnight exchanges that Benjamin first encountered Helena Ashford face to face. He was sitting in the hallway outside room 237, working on a particularly complex drawing of a musical storm, swirling patterns that incorporated both Ruby's synesthetic vision and Jasper's need for mathematical order, when footsteps echoed down the corridor. His first instinct was to hide, to gather his supplies, and disappear into the service areas before anyone could question why the night janitor was creating art instead of mopping floors. But something in the woman's posture as she approached made him pause. Helena Ashford moved with the careful control of someone carrying an enormous weight, her expensive clothes and perfect hair unable to mask the exhaustion etched into her face. She wasn't the imperious heiress the society pages portrayed, demanding perfection from a world designed to serve her every whim. She was a mother, walking the halls of her children's school at midnight because she couldn't sleep while they suffered, even when their suffering was something she couldn't fix with money or influence or sheer force of will. "You must be the mystery artist," Helena said softly, settling onto the floor beside Benjamin without apparent concern for her designer dress. "I've been reviewing the security footage, trying to understand why my children are finally sleeping through the night." Her voice carried the hoarse quality of someone who'd spent too many hours in lawyers' offices and custody mediations, fighting battles that seemed to have no clear winners. "I should probably be concerned about an unvetted adult having contact with Ruby and Jasper. Their father's attorneys would certainly have something to say about it." Benjamin tensed, ready to apologize and disappear, but Helena continued before he could speak. "But they haven't been this calm since before the divorce proceedings started. They haven't created anything this beautiful since we left their old school." She gestured towards the door where the twins' latest artistic response was displayed, a collaborative piece that showed the guardian creature teaching two young artists how to paint their dreams onto the darkness. "So instead of calling security, I'm asking you directly, what is it that you're giving them that none of their expensive therapists have managed to provide?" The question lingered in the air between them, loaded with a desperation that Benjamin recognized from his own journey through loss and healing. Helena Ashford wasn't just asking about art techniques or therapeutic methodologies. She was asking how to reach children who saw the world through different eyes, how to provide comfort for minds that processed reality in ways that traditional support systems weren't equipped to understand. She was asking the same questions that had kept Benjamin awake during those first impossible months after Luna died, when Zoe would wake up screaming from nightmares that no amount of logical explanation could dispel. "I think," Benjamin said carefully, "that sometimes children need to know they're not the only ones who see things differently. That being sensitive to light and sound and texture doesn't make them broken, just specific. That having a mind that works in patterns and systems is a gift, not a malfunction." He held up his current drawing, the musical storm that somehow captured both chaos and order in a single image. "Your children are artists, Mrs. Ashford. They're not acting out or seeking attention. They're trying to communicate in the only language that makes sense to them. Helena studied the drawing with the intensity of someone encountering a new dialect of a language she'd been trying to learn her entire life. The custody evaluator says they have behavioral issues that require intensive intervention. Their father believes they should be in a specialized residential facility where professionals can provide appropriate structure. Her voice cracked slightly on the word professionals, and Benjamin could hear years of doubt and self-questioning compressed into that single syllable. But when I see what they create with you, when I watch them sleep peacefully for the first time in months, I start to wonder if maybe the problem isn't that they're too different for the world. Maybe the problem is that the world isn't flexible enough for them. The conversation that followed stretched deep into the night. Two adults sharing the weight of loving children who didn't fit neatly into conventional categories. Helena told Benjamin about the custody battle that had turned her children into evidence in a legal proceeding, about expert witnesses who spoke about Ruby and Jasper as collections of symptoms rather than whole human beings with interior lives and creative gifts. Benjamin found himself sharing stories about Luna's work with neurodivergent children, about the art therapy techniques that had helped Zoe process her grief when traditional counseling had failed to reach her. As they talked, Benjamin learned that Helena's interest in his artwork went beyond maternal desperation. She had inherited the Ashford Gallery empire from her father, but instead of simply managing the family's extensive collection, she'd been quietly building something new, exhibitions that featured work by artists whose perspectives had been marginalized or overlooked by the traditional art world. She understood on both personal and professional levels that creativity often flourished in minds that society labeled as different or difficult. "I've been looking for authentic voices," Helena said, studying Benjamin's sketchbook with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years evaluating artistic potential. Artists who create from necessity rather than ambition, who use their work to process experiences that can't be easily categorized or commodified. She looked up at him with something approaching recognition. "Would you be interested in showing some of your pieces? Nothing formal, just a small exhibition focused on art as communication rather than decoration." The offer hung between them like a bridge Benjamin wasn't sure he was ready to cross. For 3 years, he'd lived a deliberately small life, taking comfort in routines that didn't require him to risk vulnerability or failure. The night janitor job paid enough to cover rent and groceries, and it kept him invisible in ways that felt safe after the devastating exposure of losing Luna so publicly, so completely. But sitting in this hallway, surrounded by evidence of the silent conversation he'd been having with 2 children who desperately needed someone to understand their visual language, Benjamin felt something shift inside his chest. Maybe it was time to stop hiding from the parts of himself that Luna had loved most. Maybe healing didn't always require staying small and safe. Maybe sometimes it required stepping back into the light, even when that light revealed scars and imperfections that he'd spent years trying to hide. The drawing in his hands seemed to pulse with possibility, and for the first time since Luna's death, Benjamin allowed himself to imagine a future that looked different from his carefully controlled present. But even as he felt hope stirring in his chest, Benjamin couldn't shake the feeling that accepting Helena's offer would require him to reveal truths about himself that could complicate everything. The night janitor job wasn't just a source of income. It was a carefully constructed identity that allowed him to exist without explanation or scrutiny. The moment he stepped into Helena's art world, those protective walls would crumble, and he wasn't sure he was prepared for what people might discover in the rubble. The answer came 3 weeks later, in the form of a crisis that forced Benjamin's hand in ways he never could have anticipated. Ruby was having what the school nurses called a sensory overload episode, but which Benjamin recognized as something more complex, a complete system shutdown triggered by the combination of fluorescent lights, crowded hallways, and the particular acoustic chaos of children's voices echoing off institutional walls. She'd taken refuge in the art supply closet, rocking and humming in a way that reminded Benjamin painfully of Zoe during her worst grief episodes. The standard protocol would have involved calling Helena to collect her daughter, followed by incident reports and possibly a recommendation for alternative educational placement. But Benjamin found himself ignoring protocol entirely, settling cross-legged on the closet floor and pulling out his sketchbook without asking permission or offering explanation. He began to draw, letting his hands create soothing patterns while humming along with Ruby's wordless melody. And slowly, so slowly that the watching teachers later described it as miraculous, the little girl's breathing began to steady. What happened next would be debated in faculty meetings and custody hearings for months to come. Ruby looked up at Benjamin's drawing, a simple spiral that somehow captured the feeling of sound settling into silence, and began to speak in the precise, analytical language of someone describing a scientific phenomenon. She talked about the color of the hallway noise, the texture of fluorescent light, the weight of other people's emotional states pressing against her awareness like physical objects. She described her synesthesia not as a disorder or disability, but as a complex sensory gift that occasionally overwhelmed her processing capacity. Jasper appeared in the closet doorway as his sister spoke, drawn by some invisible twin connection that transcended the usual boundaries of space and attention. Without speaking, he began arranging art supplies into geometric patterns that seemed to respond to Ruby's descriptions, creating visual representations of his sister's sensory experience that were both mathematically elegant and emotionally resonant. Together, the twins and Benjamin created an impromptu art therapy session that addressed Ruby's crisis while revealing the sophisticated ways both children understood and navigated their neurodivergent experiences. Dr. Amanda Cross, visiting the school as part of a grant evaluation for neurodiversity programs, witnessed the entire interaction from the hallway. As one of the country's leading experts in art therapy for exceptional children, she immediately recognized that what she was observing went far beyond standard crisis intervention. Benjamin's intuitive understanding of sensory processing differences, combined with his ability to create visual tools that helped the twins regulate their emotional states, represented exactly the kind of innovative approach that traditional therapeutic models often missed. But it was Dr. Cross's request to examine Benjamin's sketchbook more closely that triggered the revelation no one had been prepared for. As she flipped through pages of drawings that demonstrated not just artistic talent, but sophisticated understanding of color theory, composition, and therapeutic technique, her expression shifted from professional interest to something approaching shock. The style, the particular way Benjamin rendered light and shadow, the signature use of geometric elements integrated with organic forms, all of it matched perfectly with work she'd been trying to attribute for years. "Ah, these aren't amateur sketches," Dr. Cross said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of recognition. "This is the work of BT, the anonymous artist whose pieces have been selling at major auctions for the past 3 years, the artist whose proceeds have funded more neurodiversity research grants than any other single contributor." She looked up at Benjamin with a mixture of admiration and confusion. "Do you have any idea how many people have been trying to identify you? How many galleries would kill to represent the person behind these donations?" The words hit the small crowd of teachers and administrators like a physical force, recontextualizing everything they thought they knew about the quiet night janitor who'd somehow managed to reach 2 children that their expensive specialists couldn't help. Benjamin Mitchell wasn't just an untrained maintenance worker who'd stumbled onto an effective way to calm difficult students. He was a professional artist whose work commanded 6-figure prices, whose charitable contributions had funded breakthrough research in the exact areas where Ruby and Jasper needed support. But even as the revelation explained Benjamin's unusual effectiveness with the twins, it raised new questions that felt increasingly dangerous. Why was a successful artist working as a night janitor? What was he hiding from? And why had he chosen to remain anonymous even when his donations could have opened doors to recognition and professional opportunities? Most importantly, what did this mean for Helena's custody case, where every interaction with her children was being scrutinized for evidence of either competent or negligent parenting? Helena arrived at the school within minutes of receiving the emergency call, her face pale with the particular terror of a parent who'd been waiting for the next crisis to confirm her worst fears about her inadequacy. But instead of finding Ruby in the middle of a complete breakdown, she discovered her daughter calmly explaining the mathematics of color to a fascinated audience of educators, while Jasper created visual representations of complex emotional states with an ease that defied his age and supposed developmental delays. The sight should have filled Helena with relief, but Benjamin's presence complicated everything. If he was truly the mysterious artist whose work she'd been following and admiring for years, then his involvement with her children took on dimensions that could either strengthen or catastrophically undermine her position in the custody proceedings. Her ex-husband's legal team had been building a case around her inability to provide appropriate structure for children with special needs. The fact that Ruby and Jasper were thriving under the guidance of someone they'd assumed was an unqualified maintenance worker could be spun as evidence of Helena's poor judgment and lack of protective instincts. "We need to talk," Helena said to Benjamin, her voice carefully controlled in a way that suggested years of practice at maintaining composure under impossible circumstances. "Privately." The word carried weight that had nothing to do with the curious crowd of school personnel and everything to do with the legal and personal complications that were already beginning to cascade from this moment of revelation. Everything was about to change, and neither of them was prepared for the ways that truth could be both liberating and destructive. The conversation that followed took place in Helena's car, parked in the shadows at the edge of the academy's perfectly manicured campus. Benjamin found himself explaining 3 years of carefully constructed anonymity, describing how Luna's death had shattered not just his personal life, but his entire sense of identity as an artist. The paintings that now sold for astronomical sums had begun as grief therapy, visual prayers created in the depths of loss when words felt inadequate and traditional comfort seemed hollow and false. "I never meant for it to become commercial," Benjamin said, his hands unconsciously sketching patterns on the car window's condensation. "Luna always said that art should serve healing first, everything else second. When galleries started reaching out, when the prices started climbing, it felt like betraying her memory to profit from work that came directly from losing her." He paused, watching his finger-drawn spirals catch the streetlight. "So I stayed anonymous, donated everything, and tried to honor what she'd taught me about art as service rather than self-expression." Helena listened with the intensity of someone hearing her own story reflected in an unexpected mirror. She too had struggled with inheriting something valuable. In her case, the gallery empire that came with expectations and responsibilities she'd never asked for. She too had tried to use that inheritance in service of something larger than personal ambition, seeking out marginalized voices and supporting artists whose work challenged conventional aesthetics and social assumptions. "The custody evaluator is going to want to know why I didn't perform background checks on someone who had unsupervised contact with my children," Helena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Richard's lawyers are going to paint this as evidence that I exercise poor judgment, that I prioritize my own interests over Ruby and Jasper's safety." She turned to look at Benjamin directly, and he could see the weight of impossible choices etched into her face. "But if I distance myself from you now, if I pretend that your work with the twins was somehow inappropriate or dangerous, I'll be destroying the one thing that's actually helped them heal." The legal implications were even more complex than Helena initially realized. Benjamin's success as an anonymous artist meant that his financial situation was vastly different from what school records indicated, raising questions about why he'd chosen to work in a position that suggested economic desperation rather than creative calling. The donations he'd made to neurodiversity research organizations could be seen as either admirable philanthropy or concerning obsession, depending on how his motivations were interpreted by family court evaluators. But the most dangerous complication was the growing recognition between Benjamin and Helena that their connection was evolving beyond shared concern for Ruby and Jasper's well-being. The late-night conversations about art and healing had awakened something in both of them that had nothing to do with parental responsibility and everything to do with finding someone who understood the particular challenges of loving people whose minds worked differently than societal expectations assumed they should. That recognition became impossible to ignore when Helena's ex-husband arrived at the school the next morning, flanked by lawyers and private investigators who'd been monitoring the situation with the efficiency of people accustomed to turning personal relationships into legal weapons. Richard Ashford had built his oil empire on the principle that information was power, and he'd spent considerable resources gathering intelligence about everyone in his children's lives since the custody proceedings began. "Helena," Richard said, his voice carrying the particular coldness reserved for former spouses who'd committed the unforgivable sin of refusing to remain grateful for his provision and protection. "I've been informed that you've allowed our children to develop an inappropriate relationship with a school employee who's been misrepresenting his identity and financial status." He gestured toward Benjamin with the dismissive wave of someone accustomed to having other people cleaned up and disposed of by subordinates. "This is exactly the kind of poor judgment that demonstrates your unfitness as a primary custodial parent." The confrontation that followed would be replayed in custody hearings and settlement negotiations for months to come, but its immediate impact was devastatingly clear. Every positive development in Ruby and Jasper's emotional and creative growth could now be reframed as evidence of Helena's failure to provide appropriate supervision and protection. The anonymous art exchange that had seemed like a miraculous intervention now looked like a violation of institutional protocols and parental responsibility. Benjamin watched the legal machinery engage with the sick recognition of someone who'd seen idealism destroyed by bureaucracy before. The same creativity and intuitive understanding that had helped Ruby and Jasper find their voices would be dissected and pathologized by expert witnesses who'd never spent midnight hours listening to the wordless language of children's fear. The healing relationship that had developed between him and the twins would be reduced to policy violations and background check failures. "I should go," Benjamin said quietly, the words feeling like pieces of glass in his throat. "I should remove myself from the situation before it gets more complicated." But even as he spoke, he could see Ruby and Jasper watching from their classroom window, their faces pressed against the glass with the particular concentration of children who understood that adult conversations often determined their fate in ways they couldn't control or influence. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal consultations and emergency motions as Richard's attorneys moved quickly to capitalize on what they saw as a clear demonstration of Helena's unfitness as a custodial parent. The fact that Ruby and Jasper's behavior had improved dramatically under Benjamin's informal mentorship was reframed as evidence that Helena had failed to provide appropriate therapeutic interventions through proper channels, instead allowing her children to form potentially dangerous attachments to individuals whose backgrounds hadn't been properly vetted. Benjamin retreated into the same protective isolation that had sustained him through the worst months after Luna's death. But this time, the stakes felt impossibly higher. It wasn't just his own healing at risk, it was Ruby and Jasper's continued access to the visual language that had finally allowed them to communicate their interior experiences to the adult world. Without their midnight art exchanges, without the ongoing creative dialogue that had taught them to see their neurodivergent perspectives as gifts rather than deficits, he worried that they would retreat back into the silent suffering that had marked their first months at the academy. The regression happened faster than anyone had anticipated. Within a week of Benjamin's removal from their environment, Ruby stopped speaking in class, and Jasper's geometric organization systems became increasingly rigid and compulsive. The creative collaboration that had marked their recent artwork disappeared, replaced by repetitive patterns that spoke of anxiety rather than artistic exploration. Most devastatingly, the night crying returned. Desperate, exhausted sobs that echoed through the dormitory wing like an accusation against all the adults who'd failed to protect the fragile healing that had been taking place. Helena found herself caught in an impossible position, watching her children suffer while being powerless to restore the relationship that had provided them with their first taste of genuine understanding and acceptance. Every conversation with her legal team reinforced the same brutal calculus. Defending Benjamin's role in Ruby and Jasper's lives meant accepting responsibility for what the courts would interpret as negligent supervision, while distancing herself from him meant abandoning the one intervention that had actually helped her children develop coping strategies and creative confidence. The breaking point came during a supervised visitation with Richard, when Ruby had a complete sensory meltdown in an upscale restaurant chosen specifically because it represented the kind of environment where successful socialization was expected to occur naturally. Without Benjamin's visual tools and regulatory techniques, without the artistic vocabulary that had taught her to externalize overwhelming sensory experiences, Ruby simply shut down completely. Rocking and humming while covering her ears against the assault of conversation, cutlery, and background music that felt like physical violence against her hypersensitive nervous system. The incident was documented by Richard's legal team as clear evidence of Helena's failure to prepare Ruby for normal social situations, but Helena saw something different in her daughter's breakdown. She saw a child who'd briefly experienced what it felt like to have her differences understood and accommodated, now forced back into a world that interpreted her sensory needs as behavioral problems requiring correction rather than creative gifts requiring cultivation and support. That night, Helena made a decision that would either save or destroy her custody case, depending on factors largely beyond her control. She called Benjamin, knowing that any continued contact between them would be scrutinized and potentially weaponized against her, but unable to watch her children disappear back into silent suffering when she knew that help existed and was being denied to them for reasons that had nothing to do with their actual well-being. "I need you to help them one more time," Helena said, her voice carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who'd finally run out of acceptable options. "I know what it might cost me legally, but I can't watch Ruby and Jasper lose themselves again just because the adults in their lives are more concerned with liability than healing." She paused, and Benjamin could hear years of self-doubt and societal pressure compressed into the silence. They were becoming themselves when they worked with you, real versions of themselves, not the medicated and managed versions that everyone else seems to prefer. The conversation that began as a desperate request for temporary intervention evolved into something much more significant, a mutual recognition that both Benjamin and Helena had been hiding from their authentic selves out of fear of judgment and loss. Helena's identity as a gallery heiress had overshadowed her genuine passion for supporting marginalized artistic voices, while Benjamin's retreat into anonymity had prevented him from using his gifts in service of the healing work that Luna had believed was his true calling. "What if we stopped hiding?" Helena asked, the words carrying weight that extended far beyond their immediate crisis. "What if we built something together, not just for Ruby and Jasper, but for all the children who need people to understand that different minds create different kinds of beauty?" The question hung between them, like a bridge leading toward a future neither had dared to imagine, but which suddenly seemed not just possible, but necessary. The decision to move forward required both of them to accept risks that felt almost insurmountable. Benjamin would have to emerge from his protective anonymity, revealing not just his artistic success, but the personal losses that had driven him into hiding. Helena would have to publicly defend her parenting choices and Benjamin's role in her children's lives, knowing that family court judges often prioritized institutional credibility over actual outcomes when determining custody arrangements. But as they planned their next steps, both Benjamin and Helena found themselves energized in ways they hadn't experienced since before their respective losses and compromises. The prospect of creating something authentic and meaningful together, a space where neurodivergent children could explore their creative gifts without having to apologize for the ways their minds processed information differently, felt like a return to the idealistic motivations that had originally drawn them toward art and healing. The first step was Benjamin's decision to publicly reveal his identity as the artist behind the anonymous donations that had funded neurodiversity research for the past 3 years. The announcement, made through Dr. Cross's academic networks rather than traditional media channels, recontextualized everything that had happened at Harmony Heights Academy. Instead of a maintenance worker overstepping professional boundaries, Benjamin Mitchell was revealed as a recognized expert in art therapy techniques whose informal interventions with Ruby and Jasper represented exactly the kind of innovative approaches that conventional therapeutic models often overlooked. The revelation had immediate legal implications for Helena's custody case. Expert witnesses who'd been prepared to testify about the dangers of unsupervised contact between children and unqualified personnel found themselves in the awkward position of having to explain why they considered a nationally recognized art therapy practitioner to be inappropriate for working with children who demonstrated clear benefits from his techniques. The narrative shifted from negligent supervision to innovative intervention, particularly when Dr. Cross agreed to testify about the sophisticated understanding of neurodivergent processing styles that Benjamin's work with the twins had demonstrated. But the legal victory was almost secondary to the personal transformation that revealing his identity created for Benjamin. After 3 years of deliberate invisibility, stepping back into public recognition as an artist felt like emerging from underwater and remembering how to breathe. The conversations with journalists and researchers who wanted to understand his therapeutic techniques forced him to articulate insights about art and healing that he'd been developing intuitively since Luna's death, but had never been required to explain in professional language. More importantly, the public revelation of his success allowed Benjamin to finally integrate the different aspects of his identity: the grieving widower, the devoted father, the successful artist, and the innovative therapist, into something coherent and authentic. He was no longer hiding significant parts of himself from the people who mattered to him, no longer maintaining exhausting boundaries between his public and private selves. The custody hearing that had seemed like such a threat ultimately became an opportunity for Helena to demonstrate exactly the kind of innovative thinking and child-centered advocacy that family courts claim to prioritize in determining the best interests of children. With Benjamin's identity revealed and his expertise established, Ruby and Jasper's improved functioning under his guidance became evidence of Helena's commitment to finding effective interventions for her children's specific needs, rather than simply accepting conventional treatments that hadn't proven successful. Ruby and Jasper themselves provided the most compelling testimony, not through formal statements, but through the artwork they created during the evaluation process. Working with Benjamin in a supervised therapeutic setting, they produced collaborative pieces that demonstrated not just artistic talent, but sophisticated emotional intelligence and self-awareness. Their ability to externalize complex internal experiences through visual metaphors showed the evaluating psychologists that their previous behavioral difficulties hadn't reflected developmental delays or emotional disturbance, but rather frustration at being unable to communicate their rich interior lives through conventional verbal channels. The court's decision to award Helena primary custody was based ultimately on evidence that her children were thriving under her care, particularly when that care included access to therapeutic interventions that matched their specific neurological and creative needs. But the victory felt less significant than the broader transformation that had occurred in all of their lives through the process of fighting for it. Benjamin's emergence from anonymity had attracted attention from other parents dealing with neurodivergent children, leading to consulting requests and collaboration opportunities that felt like natural extensions of the work he'd been doing intuitively for years. Helena's public advocacy for Ruby and Jasper had connected her with other families navigating similar challenges, creating the foundation for a community of support that extended far beyond their immediate legal victory. 6 months after the custody hearing concluded, Helena opened the doors of the Ashford Center for Neurodivergent Arts, a converted warehouse space that functioned simultaneously as an art therapy clinic, exhibition gallery, and resource center for families seeking alternatives to traditional special needs programming. Benjamin served as the center's director of therapeutic programming, developing curricula that integrated artistic expression with sensory regulation techniques and emotional processing skills. The center's first exhibition featured work by Ruby and Jasper alongside pieces by other young artists whose neurodivergent perspectives had been marginalized or pathologized by conventional educational systems. The opening reception drew educators, therapists, and families from across the region, many of whom had never seen children's differences framed as sources of creative strength rather than obstacles to overcome. Ruby, now 7 and increasingly confident in her ability to describe her synesthetic experiences, gave impromptu tours of the exhibition to visitors who were curious about how color and sound intersected in her perceptual world. Her explanations were simultaneously scientifically sophisticated and poetically beautiful, demonstrating the kind of intellectual gifts that standardized assessments had consistently failed to identify or measure. Jasper had become fascinated with the architectural aspects of gallery design, creating detailed plans for exhibition spaces that accommodated different sensory processing needs while maintaining aesthetic coherence and visual impact. His designs were being studied by museum professionals who were beginning to understand that accessibility could enhance rather than compromise artistic environments. But perhaps the most significant transformation was visible in Benjamin himself, who had discovered that healing didn't require choosing between honoring Luna's memory and building a new life. His work at the center felt like a direct continuation of the therapeutic philosophy that Luna had embodied, while his relationship with Helena and her children had shown him that love didn't diminish through sharing, but rather multiplied in ways that created abundance rather than scarcity. Zoe had adapted to their expanded family configuration with the flexibility that children often demonstrate when adults model authentic emotional risk-taking. She'd developed a particularly close relationship with Ruby, whose artistic sensibilities complemented Zoe's more traditional academic strengths in ways that enriched both girls' creative development. Her relationship with Jasper was characterized by the patient mentorship of an older sibling who understood what it felt like to navigate the world with a mind that worked differently than expected. The center's success had attracted national attention from researchers and practitioners who were beginning to understand that neurodivergent children often possessed creative and intellectual gifts that conventional educational models weren't designed to recognize or cultivate. Benjamin found himself traveling to conferences and consulting with school districts that wanted to integrate art therapy techniques into their special education programming, spreading approaches that honored rather than pathologized neurological differences. But the work that felt most meaningful continued to happen in the quiet moments. The late afternoon sessions when a child who'd been labeled as behaviorally difficult discovered that their repetitive movements could be channeled into rhythmic artistic techniques, or the evening workshops where parents learned to see their children's intense interests as doorways to connection rather than obstacles to social development. Helena had found her own artistic voice through the process of advocating for Ruby and Jasper, creating mixed media pieces that explored themes of protection, transformation, and the beauty inherent in minds that processed reality through non-conventional pathways. Her work was featured in exhibitions alongside Benjamin's paintings and the children's collaborative projects, creating visual conversations that demonstrated how healing could become a creative act shared across generations and relationships. The anniversary of the center's opening was marked not with formal celebration, but with quiet recognition of how much had changed in all of their lives. Benjamin stood in the main gallery space, surrounded by artwork that represented hundreds of hours of therapeutic collaboration between neurodivergent children and adults who'd learned to see their differences as sources of creative potential rather than problems requiring correction. Ruby and Jasper were working on a new collaborative piece, a large-scale installation that incorporated Ruby's synesthetic color experiences with Jasper's mathematical pattern systems, creating a visual representation of how sibling relationships could honor individual differences while building shared meaning. Their easy collaboration spoke to the security they'd found in being understood and accepted for exactly who they were, rather than who others thought they should become. Helena approached Benjamin as he watched the children work, her presence both familiar and continuously surprising in the way that intimate relationships could contain both comfort and discovery. "Luna would be proud of what you've built here," she said quietly, and Benjamin felt the truth of that statement settle into his chest without the sharp pain that memories of his late wife had once carried. "She always said that healing happened in community," Benjamin replied, his voice carrying the particular warmth of someone who'd learned to integrate loss with new love rather than treating them as contradictory experiences. "I think she would have loved watching Ruby explain color to adults who've never considered that other people might see the world completely differently than they do." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their children, biological and chosen, create beauty from the raw materials of their unique perspectives and hard-won understanding. The quiet sounds of artistic creation filled the space around them, punctuated by soft conversations and occasional laughter as new discoveries emerged from the intersection of different minds working together toward shared goals. As evening light filtered through the gallery's windows, casting warm shadows across the children's workspace, Benjamin felt a deep sense of completion that had nothing to do with perfection and everything to do with authenticity. The journey from anonymous night janitor to recognized artist and therapeutic innovator had required him to risk everything he'd built from the ruins of his previous life, but it had led him to a version of himself that honored both his losses and his continuing capacity for love and creation. The children's voices drifted across the gallery space, discussing color temperatures and geometric relationships with the easy expertise of young artists who'd been taught to trust their perceptions and value their unique ways of processing information. In their confident collaboration, Benjamin could see the future that he and Helena were building together, a world where differences were celebrated rather than corrected, where healing happened through connection rather than isolation, and where love multiplied rather than diminished when shared across the complex networks of chosen family. The last visitors departed as darkness settled over the city, leaving the gallery space peaceful and warm in the glow of carefully positioned lighting that accommodated various sensory processing needs. Ruby had fallen asleep curled up next to her latest color study, while Jasper continued working on mathematical calculations for their next collaborative project. Zoe was reading quietly in a corner, occasionally looking up to observe the comfortable domesticity of their unconventional family gathering. Helena began the gentle process of transitioning the children toward home and bedtime routines, her movements carrying the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to create structure without rigidity, accommodation without chaos. Benjamin gathered art supplies and turned off equipment, his hands moving through familiar patterns that had become meditative rather than merely functional. As they prepared to leave the gallery space that had become the visible symbol of their commitment to honoring neurodivergent gifts, Benjamin paused to look once more at the children's collaborative installation. The piece seemed to pulse with its own internal light, geometric patterns and flowing colors, creating a visual representation of minds working together in harmony rather than competition. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: funding applications and research collaborations, therapeutic sessions with children whose gifts hadn't yet been recognized, conversations with educators and parents who were beginning to understand that different didn't necessarily mean deficient. But tonight, surrounded by the quiet evidence of healing and creativity and love that had emerged from their willingness to risk authentic connection, Benjamin Mitchell felt the deep satisfaction of someone who'd finally learned to stop hiding from his own gifts and the people who needed them most. The drive home through the quiet city streets was filled with the comfortable silence of a family that had learned to communicate through presence as much as words, their different ways of processing and expressing emotion woven together into something resilient and beautiful and entirely their own. And in the peaceful breathing of children who finally felt safe enough to sleep deeply, Benjamin could hear the echo of Luna's voice, reminding him that the most important art was always the kind that helped other people remember they weren't alone in the world.